There's a man in every room who seems to know something the others do not. He does not talk the most. He does not move the most. But when he speaks, the room shifts. When he decides, people follow without being asked. When he leaves, something leaves with him that no one can quite name. You have been in rooms with that man. You have felt the difference, and you have wondered, at least once, what exactly he knows that you do not. It is not charisma. Charisma is a performance, and performances can be read. It's not dominance. Dominance requires constant maintenance and produces resistance. What that man has is something older and more precise. It is an understanding of how situations actually work beneath the surface, how attention moves, how decisions get made before anyone in the room thinks a decision is being made, how the man who understands these mechanisms can position himself at the center of any situation without ever appearing to try. Dark psychology is not manipulation in the crude sense. It is not tricks or scripts or calculated performances. At its most precise, it is the disciplined study of how human behavior actually operates beneath the story people tell about their behavior. The Stoics called this knowledge of the ruling faculty, the capacity to see clearly how people function, including yourself, and to use that clarity to move through the world with a precision that others experience as authority, composure, and inevitable control. The men who have applied these principles throughout history did not look like manipulators. They looked like leaders. They looked like the calmest person in the room. They looked like the man who always seemed to know what was about to happen before it happened. Because they were not reacting to situations, they were reading them. And reading a situation accurately before anyone else does is the closest thing to total control that exists in a world where you cannot control other people directly. Dr. Robert Cialdini at Arizona State University spent decades mapping the automatic compliance mechanisms embedded in human social behavior. His research demonstrated that the vast majority of human decisions are not made through conscious deliberation. They are made through a set of deeply wired social heuristics, shortcuts the brain uses to navigate complex social environments without spending the cognitive resources that genuine deliberation requires. The man who understands these heuristics does not override them in others. He moves in alignment with them. And that alignment produces a quality of influence that feels, to the people experiencing it, like natural authority rather than engineered outcome. Think about every situation you have walked out of feeling like something happened that you did not fully see. The deal that went sideways in ways you cannot explain. The conversation where the conclusion felt predetermined and you were the last to realize it. The room where someone less qualified, less articulate, and less prepared than you walked away with exactly what you both wanted. That feeling of having missed something is accurate. You did miss something. Not because you were not intelligent. Because you were reading the performance while someone else was reading the mechanism behind it. Marcus Aurelius studied human nature the same way a general studies terrain. Not to exploit it. To understand it precisely enough to navigate it without friction. He wrote in his private journals that to understand what moves people is to understand what moves the world. 9 principles follow, each one a mechanism, each one operational today. Principle 1. Read the room before you enter it. Every situation has a structure that precedes you. Dr. Nalini Ambady at Tufts University conducted extensive research on what she called pre-interaction processing. the information gathering that happens before a formal interaction begins. Her studies showed that the most socially effective individuals consistently spent more time in observation before engaging than less effective individuals. They were not passive, they were collecting data. The quality of every move made inside a situation is determined by the accuracy of the reading done before the move. Every room has a structure before you walk in. There is a person who holds the most social capital and a person who holds the least. There is a tension that is being managed and a question that is being avoided. There is an agenda that is stated and an agenda that is not. The man who enters a room and immediately begins speaking or performing has surrendered the most valuable 30 seconds available to him. The man who enters, pauses, and reads has already begun to understand something that the speakers and performers will not understand until the conversation is nearly over. Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War that every battle is won before it is fought. He was describing pre-engagement analysis. The general who understands the terrain, the disposition of the enemy, and the condition of his own forces before contact does not win through superior force in the moment. He wins because the outcome was already determined by the quality of his reading before the moment arrived. This principle applies in every negotiation, every meeting, every social situation where outcomes matter. The application is a discipline of entry. Before any significant interaction, ask 3 questions. Who holds the power in this room and why? What does each person in this room most need to be true? What is not being said that is driving everything that is being said? These 3 questions, answered before you speak, give you a map that most people in the room do not have. And the man with the map always moves more effectively than the men without one. Principle 2. Control the frame, and you control the outcome before the first word is spoken. Dr. George Lakoff at the University of California, Berkeley, spent his career studying how conceptual frames shape human judgment and decision-making. His central finding was that people do not respond to facts. They respond to facts filtered through a frame. The frame determines which facts seem relevant, which conclusions seem logical, and which outcomes seem acceptable. The person who establishes the frame of a conversation before the conversation begins has already determined the range of possible outcomes. Everything that follows happens inside the territory they defined. Frame control is not about lying or distorting reality. It is about establishing the lens through which reality is examined. In a negotiation, the man who opens by establishing the criteria for a good outcome has framed the entire discussion. Every subsequent argument from both sides will be evaluated against those criteria. If he established the criteria, he wins arguments simply by being consistent with a standard he set. His opponent is arguing inside a frame that was designed before they arrived. Marcus Aurelius used frame control in every public address he gave as emperor. He did not argue for his decisions after the fact. He established the principles by which decisions should be made before the specific decisions were announced. By the time the specific decision arrived, the audience had already agreed to the framework that made the decision inevitable. He was not persuading them in the moment. He had persuaded them in advance by establishing the ground on which the persuasion would occur. The practical application is to identify the frame of any significant conversation you are entering and ask whether you are accepting it or establishing it. If someone else defined the terms of the discussion, the criteria for success, or the standard against which proposals will be measured, you are operating inside their frame. Reframe early. Reframe with a question rather than a statement. Ask what we are actually trying to achieve here, and you have just established yourself as the person who sets the criteria for success. Principle 3. The person asking the questions controls the conversation. Always ask more than you answer. Dr. Edgar Schein at MIT. Sloan School of Management spent decades studying what he called humble inquiry, the practice of asking genuine questions as the primary mode of influence in professional and social environments. His research showed that the individual who asks more questions than they answer consistently generates more trust, more information, and more influence than the individual who provides more answers than they ask questions. The questioner is perceived as more intelligent, more interested, and more authoritative than the answerer, regardless of the actual content of either. The mechanism is precise. Questions direct attention. When you ask a question, you determine what the other person thinks about next. You set the agenda of their mind for the next 30 seconds. A series of well-chosen questions shapes the entire direction of a conversation without the questioner ever having to assert a position. By the time the conversation ends, the other person has arrived at a conclusion through their own thinking that the questioner guided without their awareness. Socrates built an entire philosophical method on this mechanism. The Socratic method was not designed to teach. It was designed to lead. By asking questions that exposed the internal contradictions in a person's stated beliefs, Socrates guided them to conclusions they would never have reached independently, conclusions they could not reject because they had generated them themselves. The most powerful form of persuasion is the kind where the other person believes they arrived at the conclusion freely. Questions are the instrument of that form. The discipline is to respond to statements with questions and to assertions with curiosity. When someone states a position, ask what leads them to that view. When someone makes a demand, ask what outcome they are actually trying to achieve. When someone challenges you, ask what specifically concerns them. Each question gathers information and redirects the conversation simultaneously. The man who masters this discipline does not need to argue. He guides. And guidance is always more powerful than argument, because argument produces resistance, and guidance produces discovery. Principle 4. Understand what people actually want, not what they say they want. Dr. Abraham Maslow at Brandeis University mapped the hierarchy of human motivation in his landmark research, published in 1943. His framework, refined over decades, identified the deep drivers that operate beneath stated preferences. People say they want a raise. They want recognition that their contribution is valued. People say they want more information. They want to feel that they are trusted. People say they want a different outcome. They want to feel that their interests matter to someone with power over the outcome. The stated want is almost never the actual want, and the man who addresses the actual want while others address the stated one operates at a completely different level of influence. This is what distinguishes the negotiator who consistently achieves outcomes from the one who consistently fails despite equally strong positions. The effective negotiator is not focused on the stated position of the other party. He is focused on the interest beneath the position What does this person actually need to walk away feeling? What must be true for them to say yes? In most cases, the answer to those questions costs far less to provide than winning the argument about the stated position. And once the underlying need is met, the stated position becomes flexible. Henry Kissinger was studied extensively by political scientists for his ability to achieve outcomes in negotiations where the structural conditions seem to make agreement impossible. The consistent pattern in his approach was that he spent more time understanding what each party needed to be able to say to their own constituency than what they were actually demanding at the table. The stated demands were performances for external audiences. The actual needs were manageable. He addressed the needs and let the other parties manage their performances. And he achieved outcomes that everyone said were impossible before he walked in. There is a specific technique that elite negotiators use to locate the unstated need rapidly. They ask what a successful outcome would allow the other party to do, say, or feel that they cannot currently do, say, or feel. The answer to that question almost never matches the stated position. A company negotiating hard on price is often trying to demonstrate to their board that they protected the budget. A person demanding an apology is often trying to feel that they mattered enough to warrant one. A partner demanding more time is often trying to feel that they are a priority rather than an obligation. The stated demand is the symptom. The feeling is the cause. Treat the cause. Before any significant interaction, ask yourself what this person actually needs from this conversation. Not what they are asking for, what they need. What they need to feel, to believe, to be able to say afterward. Address that need, and the stated demand often resolves itself. Ignore that need, and no amount of logical argument will close the gap. Principle 5. Use silence as an active instrument, not a passive gap. The psychology of silence in social interaction was mapped precisely by Dr. Adam Jaworski at the University of Hong Kong in his research on what he called communicative silence. His finding distinguished between passive silence, the absence of speech, and active silence, the deliberate use of non-speech, as a communicative act. Active silence is not empty. It carries specific information. It says that what was just said is being taken seriously. It says that a response will come when it is ready, rather than when social pressure demands it. It says that the person maintaining it is not governed by the discomfort of others. In any interaction where tension is present, the first person to break the silence has revealed something. They have revealed that the silence was more uncomfortable for them than for the other person. That discomfort is information about where the leverage sits. The man who can sit in silence without fidgeting, without explaining, without softening the moment, is communicating authority at a level that no words could achieve. He is demonstrating that he is not managed by the social environment. He manages himself inside it. Abraham Lincoln used silence in cabinet meetings with a precision his secretaries documented carefully. When a difficult question was raised that Lincoln had not yet decided how to answer, he would tell a story. Not to answer the question, but to buy time while appearing to engage. By the time the story ended, the room had shifted. The question was no longer in the same frame, and Lincoln had had 3 additional minutes to observe the room and decide how to respond. He was never silent in the obvious sense, but he was always controlling the pace of the conversation, which is the same thing. Practice sitting with silence for 3 full seconds before responding in any high-stakes conversation. Not as a performance, as a genuine pause during which you are actually processing what was said rather than preparing your response while the other person is still speaking. That 3-second gap changes everything. It changes the quality of your response. It changes how others read you. And over time, it becomes the signature of a man who considers before he acts, which is one of the most powerful things you can communicate in any environment. Principle 6. Anchor first. Whoever sets the first number owns the range. Dr. Daniel Kahneman at Princeton University and Dr. Amos Tversky at Hebrew University documented what they called the anchoring effect in their foundational research on cognitive bias. Their finding was one of the most robust in all of psychology. When people make estimates or judgments in conditions of uncertainty, the first number they encounter has a disproportionate influence on their final judgment, even when that number is entirely arbitrary, and they know it. The anchor sets the reference point. Everything that follows is evaluated as a deviation from the anchor rather than on its own terms. In any negotiation, any discussion of value, any situation where a range of outcomes is possible, the person who names the first number owns the psychological territory of the entire discussion. The other party will adjust from that anchor rather than from their own independent assessment. If the anchor is aggressive, the final outcome will be pulled toward the aggressive end of the range, even if the final number is a compromise. The compromise happens inside the territory the anchor defined. This principle operates far beyond explicit negotiation. It operates in any situation where expectations are being set. The executive who opens a performance review by noting 3 areas of exceptional performance has set an anchor before any discussion of problems begins. The problems will be evaluated relative to that anchor. The salesman who opens by describing the premium version before mentioning price has anchored perception of value before cost enters the conversation. Every situation where outcomes matter has an anchoring opportunity. The man who takes it consistently operates at an advantage that compounds over every interaction. Principle 7. Manage energy, not just information. People decide with how they feel. Dr. Antonio Damasio at the University of Southern California produced research that permanently altered how scientists understand human decision-making. His work on patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region that connects cognition with emotion, revealed something startling. These patients could reason perfectly. They could analyze options, identify trade-offs, and articulate logical conclusions. What they could not do was decide. Without the emotional signal that tells the brain which option matters, rational analysis produced infinite deliberation and no choice. Emotion is not the enemy of good decision-making. It is the mechanism of all decision-making. The practical consequence of this research is significant. If you want to influence how someone decides, influencing how they think is insufficient. You must also influence how they feel in the moment of decision. The man who understands this does not just make arguments. He manages the emotional environment in which the arguments are received. He calibrates his own energy so that the room feels a specific way when he speaks. He is aware of the emotional state of the people he is engaging with and adjusts his approach based on what that state will do to their processing. Marcus Aurelius documented this in his observations of Roman Senate dynamics. He noted that the same argument, delivered in a room that was tense and defensive, produced resistance. Delivered in a room that was calm and attentive, it produced agreement. He began developing the practice of managing the emotional tone of the room before making any significant proposal. Not through manipulation of emotions, but through the management of his own presence, his pace, his silence, and the questions he asked before stating his position. By the time he spoke, the room was in a state that made his words land differently. Principle 8. Let others underestimate you. Invisibility is the highest form of leverage. Dr. Adam Galinsky at Columbia Business School studied the strategic use of power in social and professional environments for over 2 decades. One of his most counterintuitive findings concerned the relationship between perceived power and actual outcomes. Individuals who were consistently underestimated by their counterparts achieved significantly better outcomes in negotiation and competition than individuals who were accurately assessed or overestimated. Being underestimated is not a disadvantage. It is a structural advantage that compounds with every interaction where the other party fails to prepare for your actual capability. The Stoics called this the discipline of reserve. Seneca wrote that the wise man holds back more than he deploys, not from weakness, but from the understanding that reserve is power. The man who has shown everything he has is transparent and therefore manageable. The man who has shown a fraction of what he has maintains an uncertainty in others that functions as leverage. They do not know what he is capable of. And the unknown capability of a composed, quiet man is always estimated higher than the known capability of a loud one. Ulysses Grant entered the Vicksburg campaign as a general that the Confederate command had largely dismissed based on his early career record and unremarkable personal presentation. He was not glamorous. He did not inspire the conventional signals of military genius. He was quiet, direct, and entirely unpredictable. The Confederate commanders prepared for the general they thought they knew and encountered a completely different one. The underestimation was not accidental. Grant understood what he was and what others saw when they looked at him. And he used the gap between those two things with lethal precision. Resist the urge to prove yourself before it is necessary. Let the room form its impression. Let them underestimate the cost of underestimating you. And when the moment arrives where your actual capability is relevant, deploy it completely and without announcement. The contrast between expectation and reality is itself a form of power. It resets every assumption in the room simultaneously. Principle 9. The man who controls himself controls everything else by default. Every principle covered here converges on this final one. Frame control, silence, reading the room, managing energy, strategic invisibility. All of it depends on one prerequisite. The man deploying these tools must be in control of himself while he deploys them. A man who understands every mechanism of social influence but loses his composure under pressure is a man with tools he cannot use when they matter most. The self is the instrument, and an untuned instrument produces noise, regardless of how sophisticated the music it is attempting to play. Dr. Walter Mischel at Stanford University conducted the famous marshmallow studies in the 1960s and 70s, tracking children who demonstrated the ability to delay gratification and those who did not, following them for decades. The children who could wait, who could sit with discomfort without surrendering to it, showed measurably better outcomes across every domain studied: academic performance, professional achievement, relationship stability, physical health. The capacity for self-regulation was not just one factor among many. It was the factor that determined how every other capacity was deployed. Marcus Aurelius wrote that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. He was not offering consolation. He was describing a complete system. The man who has trained his internal responses, who does not need external conditions to be favorable in order to function at his best, who can move through chaos with the same precision he moves through calm, that man is not controlled by situations. He moves through them. And the quality of that movement, sustained over time, in condition after condition, is what total control actually looks like from the outside. It does not look like force. It does not look like dominance. It looks like a man who is never quite as affected as you expected him to be, who always seems to have considered the angle you thought you had on him, who responds to pressure the way a deep-rooted tree responds to wind. The branches move. The root does not. Here is what you apply today. The first action is to enter your next significant interaction in observation mode for the first 60 seconds. Do not speak first. Watch who speaks, what they reveal, and where the tension sits. That 60 seconds of data is worth more than the first 5 minutes of performance. The second action is to reframe one conversation this week by asking what we are actually trying to achieve before the discussion of how begins. That single question establishes you as the person who sets the criteria and moves the conversation onto ground you defined. The third action is to replace one statement with a question in your next high-stakes conversation. When you would normally assert, ask instead. Notice what the question produces that the statement never would. Notice how it shifts who is directing the thinking. The fourth action is to identify the unstated need in one relationship or negotiation this week. What does this person actually need to feel or believe for this to work? Address that need directly and watch how the stated obstacle becomes less fixed than it appeared. The fifth action is to set one anchor this week before someone else does. In any situation where a range of outcomes is possible, name the first number, the first standard, the first criteria. Do it calmly, directly, and without apology. Notice what the rest of the conversation organizes itself around. There is one final thing to understand about everything covered here. These principles are not weapons to use against people. They are instruments of navigation. The man who uses them to exploit others will find that the results are short-term and the costs are permanent. Trust, once lost through manipulation, is almost never recovered. Reputation, once associated with cynical influence, attracts defensive counterparts and suspicious environments. The application of these principles that produces lasting results is the application directed at clarity, at genuine understanding, at the ability to create outcomes that work for everyone in the room while never surrendering what actually matters to you. That combination, precision without predation, is the signature of a man who has genuinely mastered the principles rather than merely learned to perform them. Total control is not a destination. It is a practice. It is the daily application of principles that, compounded over months and years, produce a man who moves through the world with a quality that others experience as authority inevitability, and quiet power. Not because he forces outcomes, because he understands the terrain well enough that he is never surprised by it. And the man who is never surprised is always, in every room, the most dangerous man present. The next video is already loaded. It covers the 5 things that Stoics never do. The hidden rules of power that separate the men who accumulate influence quietly from the men who spend their entire lives performing strength they do not have. Watch it now.